My second string quartet is one of my most viewed videos on this channel, so I figured now is as good a time as any to show you how I actually went about writing this piece. Now, in case you haven't heard it yet, this is what the last section of the piece sounds like. So I'm gonna break this video down into 3 parts. 1, inspiration. What drove me to write this piece in the first place? 2, execution. How did I come up with musical material from these bits of inspiration? And 3, reflection. What are the things that went well for this piece, and what are some things I could learn for next time? So let's get started with inspiration. So a couple years ago, I was really infatuated with the Italian Renaissance composer and theorist Nicola Vicentino. And I was watching on YouTube people playing these microtonal keyboards that had several manuals that could play things that are in between the cracks of what we would typically hear on the piano. So I thought to myself, wow, wouldn't it be interesting to write a piece that was inspired by that? So I went digging online to find out if Mr. Vicentino had any text written about any of his pieces to explain what his writing process was. And I did. There's this musical treatise that basically explains how he wrote all these different pieces. And one of those pieces in particular is called Musica Prisca Caput, which is this really amazing 4-part chorale that has 3 sections to it. The first part is completely diatonic. It's in F major. The second section showcases the 12 notes of the chromatic scale. And then the third section is completely microtonal. He starts getting in between the cracks of his microtonal keyboard. And around this time, I was being commissioned to write a string quartet. So I thought to myself, wow, wouldn't this be the perfect opportunity to take this 4-part chorale and figure out a way to compose a piece from this material on a 4-part string quartet? Okay, now that I found the inspiration for the piece, it's time for the hard part, the execution. So my goal was I want to figure out how to manifest those 3 parts into a piece for string quartet with a couple of parameters. The first one, I didn't want to quote any of the material directly into the piece because that's from the late Renaissance period. I felt like if I started quoting for the piece, it would be immediately recognizable that I was taking something anachronistically from the past. So I didn't want to do that. The second thing I wanted to do was incorporate many different Middle Eastern kamanja techniques. So basically the Arabic version of the violin. I wanted to have as many of these techniques as possible. So let's head to the first moments from the string quartet. So right at the beginning, you'll see if you look at all the main pitches, they're all basically diatonic notes. So you have G, you have E's going on, you have A's going on. Now you'll notice that I do incorporate some quarter tones, but that's only because I wanted to add a little bit of the flavor of the Middle Eastern melodies into it. I wanted to have a little bit of the F half sharp in there. Sometimes there's A half flat that gets in there. So this is more of an ornamentation. They're not these main central notes that come from the Vicentino. So in the beginning of the piece, I wanted to set up what is the overall vocabulary of the different techniques that are being used. So there's a few of them that I want to point out. The first one is the use of the F half sharp, which is already unusual to begin with. The second thing is it's a grace note with a slash through it, and I'll get back to what I mean by slash through it a little bit later. And the third thing is that it has a glissando. So there are many little micro techniques going on in one notation of a technique, but I wanted to do this so that it sets you up for the next thing that you're going to hear, which is in that same second measure, but now in the first violin. So here you have the same thing, but now you have it at the very end of the phrase. So you see F half sharp, G, A, G, but it's happening at the very end of the phrase and it's decrescendoing. So instead of it being this loud ornament at the very beginning of the phrase, like it is on the second violin part, it's a very quiet ornamentation at the very end of the third beat in the first violin, and it has more notes to it, and there's no glissando. So if you think about it this way, there's like a lot of decisions being made here in just one measure, and this will set us up for the entire rest of the piece going forward. So it's really important, in my opinion, that in the first couple bars of any piece you write, you really establish a language that you're going to set up for the rest of the piece. Now, if we head over to measure 10, you'll see the first instance of grace notes that don't have a slash through them. So in my score, that means actually play those grace notes on the beat. So slash grace notes means play before the beat. Unslash grace notes mean play on the beat. So here is a perfect example of that in measure 10. Now for me, when conceiving of the second section of the piece, the chromatic section, I didn't just want to start introducing chromatic notes. I wanted to completely change the vibe of the section as well. So here at measure 101, you'll see that we have the entire section playing tremolando effects, which to me mimic the kind of sound you get on the qanun, which is this kind of zither type of instrument that they play in the Middle East. So not only do we have the chromatic notes filling in, we also have the entire sound world changing. So to me, this is going to be an obvious change when we get to this spot. So for me, it's not just about copying the chord progression from the Vicentino. I'm also trying to figure out, okay, how can I recompose it to my taste? And my taste here is that, okay, I want to hear the tremolando effect that's very different from these held notes and these glissandi that are coming from the very first section of the piece. Another thing in this section I want to do is replicate that idea of breathing that the choir singers were doing in their rendition of the Vicentino. So here you actually see these little things that look like commas on top of the staves. And what this means is that you're going to have a little tiny pause in the rendering of each of these tremolandi. So this is just my way of recomposing not just the actual physical pitches that are being performed, but what is the technique that's being done with these choir singers? What else are they doing besides just singing? And of course, they're breathing as well. And as the piece is continuing on, you'll notice that all the techniques are cumulative. So all those grace notes, all those quarter tones, all those glissandi, they're cumulative in the piece itself. So every time something gets added, it stays within the entire realm of the piece. So for me, things start to get interesting in section 3 of the piece when it gets all microtonal and all hell breaks loose, basically. So here at measure 160, I do this by taking the cello line, which starts at A, just a normal A, and I start glissandoing very, very, very slowly across 8 beats to B flat, which is just one semitone above the A. So you're going to hear all the microtonal shades of A into B flat. Then at 162, you hear a very simple B flat major chord. Now, we've heard quarter tones in this piece before, but they were never really done in such a way that they were functionally harmonic, like they were in the Vicentino. So here's the first time that we actually get these quarter tones as part of functionally harmonic chords. So the first chord of 163, you do see a B flat major chord. And then the third chord, you see that B flat major chord again, but it's revoiced slightly differently. The only thing that's making this bar a little bit strange is that chord in between. Now, if you look at it from a voice leading point of view, there's not much strange things going on. The top voice just goes stepwise, D, E, half flat, F. The second voice, although not completely stepwise, is in a small range, F, A flat, B flat. The viola, B flat, C, D, completely stepwise. And the cello, B flat, D, B flat, which is just going up a major third and going down. But when you hear that second chord all together at once, there's no semblance of any triadic harmony in it. It's a D, C, B flat, and then E half flat. In reality, it's a cluster chord, but the special thing about the sonority here is that even though by itself it sounds like a cluster chord, when you put it in this context with the B flat major chords around it and the voice leading rules all working properly, it actually just sounds like a passing chord, like you would have it in regular 4-part Bach chorale type of harmony. So this tenet here was the crucial thing that I figured out in this very beginning of the section, which helped me write all the chord progressions from this point all the way to the very end. So the main takeaway here is that you're building this perception funnel, as I like to call it, where you are establishing a vocabulary. It doesn't matter if it's melodic, harmonic, rhythmic, textural, it doesn't matter what it is, but you're building this vocabulary that's personal to you, and then you develop it throughout the entire rest of the section. So let's go back full circle to that excerpt that I showed you at the beginning of this video and I'll show you how I came up with this. Here at measure 203, you'll notice that the very first chord is a D major chord up a quarter tone. So the D on the bottom is a D half sharp. The A in the viola is up a half sharp. The D in the second violin is up a half sharp, and the F sharp in the first violin is up a half sharp. So it's a D major chord when you hear it all together, just slightly tuned up. The third chord, you'll notice, is a D major chord again, but the voicing is slightly different. So on the bottom, you have a D half sharp. On the viola, you have an F sharp that's up a quarter tone. Then in the second violin, you have a D half sharp. And then in the first violin, you have an A half sharp. So it's a D major chord again, but up a quarter tone. Now, look at the second chord. The second chord, F 3/4 sharp. So it's like an F sharp up a quarter tone. Then you have an E up a quarter tone. Then you have a C half sharp. Then you have a G 3/4 sharp. So again, it's another pseudo-cluster chord that's acting as a passing chord between two chords that are otherwise triadic. So this tenet that was introduced like 40 measures before is happening again in this context, but now it's in a completely different realm. Instead of going from B flat major to B flat major, like we did before, we're going from D half sharp major to D half sharp major. Then fast forward a couple measures later, we land at measure 206, where you have this G major sonority all of a sudden. So now we're getting this juxtaposition of the major chord that we heard before, that B flat major chord, now manifested as a G major chord, so it's a third away. And then we have that D half sharp major chord, which is also some kind of third away from B flat major that was introduced in measure 160. So all these things are working together really tightly, helping us to have this perception funnel go through the entire last section of this piece. Now, after finally finishing the piece and then hearing the premiere performance of the piece, I go into what I call a reflection period, where I think about, okay, what are the things that I really liked about what I came up with, and what are some of the things that could have been a little bit better? I think it's really important that you identify what went well first. That way you can take some of those tools that you spent so much time figuring out and repeating them in a future piece. After all, that's how one ends up developing their personal voice. It happens over time. It happens after figuring out what things actually went well in a piece that you wrote. And it happens with repetition of those tools that you created in those pieces that you wrote over many, many months or many, many years. So for me, I think one of the things that really worked well is taking off that initial pressure that I had while writing this piece in terms of how do I come up with form. So what I mean by that is I think that when you start a brand new piece, it's really easy just to want to start from the beginning and go from the beginning all the way to end and just let the muses or whatever happens in your life affect every bar of the piece. And for me, that's a very dangerous way to write music because, of course, our mood changes from day to day. Maybe we don't feel like writing from one day to the next. Maybe we go 2 weeks or 3 weeks without writing, which happens to me sometimes. So for me, it really allowed me to focus on a bunch of other musical parameters other than form. That checkbox was already written next to it. That discipline of having a set form was really valuable for me for future pieces. That way I can say, well, what are some other forms I'm really interested in pursuing other than this Vicentino? And then that would inspire new ideas for future pieces. Now, to me, most of the things that could have been done better have to do with notation itself. So here on measure 19, you could see that I have this slashed grace note going into an eighth note on beat 3 of the measure. Now, when you look at this bar, it doesn't really sound the way that it looks. The first beat, for example, is a half note, and it doesn't really take up as much space as it should. It really should be a little bit wider so it takes up more space in the bar. Then the next thing you'll notice here is that there's a grace note glissing to an eighth note. And normally you would want that grace note to be as close as you can to the eighth note so that they can see that, oh, that grace note is at the very end of the half note that we're playing on the first beat. If you look at the viola, it's really, really bad. I have these glissandos that are super long, but in reality, that glissando is basically this. Beep. That's really what it should be. So when you look at the music, it does not look like the way I just sang it. Another thing I wish I could have done better is the notation at measure 203. So by the way, you'll recognize that we already saw this measure before. We could see that it's very clear what it's supposed to be in the present form. It's a D major chord up a quarter tone here on beat 1. That's not always what it looks like. Look at this version. This is a previous version. Look at the spelling of this chord. D half sharp, A half sharp, D half sharp, G half flat. Now in my mind, I thought it would be a lot easier to have G half flat than F 3/4 sharp. I was trying to limit the number of microtones I had in this piece. I only wanted to use a half flat and a half sharp. I didn't want to introduce 3/4 flat and 3/4 sharp. I thought in my mind it would be easier just to have 2 additional accidentals rather than 4. I was wrong. When the quartet initially played this, they had no idea where that G flat was falling in the chord. It was very hard to figure out. So now that I have F 3/4 sharp instead of G half flat, it's very clear to the players that, okay, this is a D major chord with all the notes of that chord raised up a quarter tone. I didn't realize this. It was my mistake. I fixed it in the score. Now it's very clear for the next performance of the piece. And that's basically it, folks. I got nothing else. So enjoy your day. Thanks so much for watching, and until next time.